February 27, 1999. Behind a brick building on Cromwell Avenue in the Bronx, a maintenance worker approached a dumpster for what should have been routine trash collection. What he found instead would haunt him forever. Inside a black plastic bag, carefully hidden and left behind like nothing mattered, were the remains of 13-year-old Minerliz Soriano. 3 days earlier, Minnie had walked out of Intermediate School 162, just like she did every day. The Dominican-American 8th grader loved poetry, excelled in her studies, and was known for her kind heart. The walk home was only a few blocks, through the Melrose section of the Bronx, a path she knew by heart. But on February 24th, Minerliz Soriano never made it home. For 22 years, her attacker walked free, living quietly, working for the city, hiding in plain sight, until forensic science finally caught up with him, revealing a truth that would shock everyone who knew the family. The person who took everything from Minnie was someone they had trusted, someone who had been their neighbor. This is the story of how DNA genealogy solved a case that seemed impossible to crack, and how justice finally found its way to a 13-year-old girl who deserved so much more than the world gave her. If you're interested in more true crime cases solved by cutting-edge forensic science, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Let's get into this case. In 1999, 13-year-old Minerliz Soriano was living the life of any typical teenager in the Melrose section of the Bronx. Friends and family knew her as Minnie, a bright, creative girl who found joy in writing poetry and took her education seriously. She was in 8th grade at Intermediate School 162, where teachers remembered her as dedicated and kind-hearted. Minnie lived with her family in one of the housing complexes that dotted this working-class Dominican-American neighborhood. The Bronx in the late 90s was a place where community mattered. Neighbors knew each other. Children played in courtyards, while parents watched from apartment windows. It was the kind of place where a 13-year-old could walk home from school alone, without parents losing sleep over it. The route from Minnie's school to her building was straightforward, just a few blocks through familiar streets she had navigated hundreds of times. February in New York meant short days and cold air, but for an 8th grader eager to get home, it was just another part of daily routine. This was Minnie's world, close-knit, predictable, safe, a place where a girl could dream about her future, write poetry about her hopes, and trust that tomorrow would come, just like every day before. But on February 24th, 1999, that sense of security would be shattered forever, leaving a family and community grappling with a nightmare that seemed impossible in their quiet corner of the Bronx. February 24th, 1999, began like any other Wednesday for Minerliz Soriano. The winter sun cast long shadows across the Bronx as students filed out of Intermediate School 62 at the end of another school day. Minnie gathered her books, said goodbye to her friends, and stepped out into the crisp February air. She had homework to finish, maybe some poetry to write. Home was just a few blocks away. The walk should have taken 10 minutes. Down the familiar streets she had traveled countless times, past the storefronts and apartment buildings that made up her neighborhood. Other students scattered in different directions, heading to their own homes, their voices fading as they disappeared around corners and through doorways. Soon, Minnie was walking alone. Somewhere between the school and her family's building, Minerliz Soriano disappeared. Hours passed. The afternoon stretched into evening. Minnie's family expected her home by her usual time, but the apartment remained quiet. No sound of her key in the lock. No backpack dropped by the door. No cheerful voice calling out that she was home. As darkness settled over the Bronx, worry transformed into panic. Her family began making phone calls. Friends, classmates, anyone who might have seen her. They walked the route she would have taken, calling her name, peering into doorways and alleys. They contacted the school, hoping maybe she had stayed late for an activity they had forgotten about. But there was nothing. No one had seen Minnie after she left school that afternoon. By nightfall, they called the police. A missing persons report was filed for 13-year-old Minerliz Soriano. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, speaking with residents, asking if anyone had noticed anything unusual. The investigation that would consume the next 22 years had begun. For 3 agonizing days, Minnie's family held on to hope. Maybe she had gotten lost. Maybe she was staying with a friend and couldn't call home. Maybe she was hurt somewhere and couldn't get help, but she was alive. They distributed flyers with her photograph, organized search parties, and prayed for her safe return. On February 27th, that hope ended. A maintenance worker making his rounds behind a building on Cromwell Avenue noticed something troubling about one of the dumpsters, a black plastic trash bag that seemed heavier than it should be, positioned in a way that looked deliberate rather than carelessly tossed. When he opened it, the discovery would haunt him for the rest of his life. The contents of the bag confirmed the family's worst fear. It was Minerliz Soriano. The medical examiner would later determine that Minnie had been attacked and had lost her life. The 13-year-old girl who loved poetry and dreamed of her future had endured something terrible in her final moments. Her attacker had then discarded her in a way that stripped her of dignity, as if her life meant nothing at all. The news shattered the Bronx community. Parents pulled their children closer. The sense of safety that had defined this neighborhood disappeared overnight. A dangerous individual had walked among them, someone capable of targeting a child, someone who had taken Minnie from the street in broad daylight and destroyed not just her life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. Police cordoned off the crime scene and began processing evidence. They collected DNA samples, fingerprints, and any physical evidence that might lead them to the perpetrator. Detectives interviewed neighbors, classmates, and anyone who might have information about Minnie's final hours. The investigation consumed resources and manpower as the NYPD threw everything they had at solving what happened to Minerliz Soriano. But as weeks turned to months, the case grew cold. Despite their best efforts, investigators found no clear suspects, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious, and no DNA matches in their databases. The perpetrator had seemingly disappeared as completely as Minnie had on that February afternoon. What no one knew then was that the person responsible for this horrific crime was hiding in plain sight. Someone the family knew, someone they had trusted, someone who would continue living his life for 22 more years, while Minnie's family mourned and searched for answers. What do you think happened to Minerliz on her walk home? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button if you want to see justice for Minnie. The discovery of Minerliz Soriano's remains behind the Cromwell Avenue building launched one of the most intensive investigations the NYPD had seen in years. Crime scene technicians worked methodically, photographing every angle, collecting every piece of potential evidence. The black plastic bag became crucial evidence, as did the dumpster and surrounding area. Most importantly, investigators were able to recover DNA evidence from the scene, genetic material that would prove vital 2 decades later. The forensic examination revealed the serious nature of the crime. Minnie had been attacked before losing her life. The medical examiner estimated she had passed away within hours of her disappearance, meaning someone had taken her from the street in broad daylight, committed these terrible acts, and disposed of her remains with chilling calculation. Detective units fanned out across the Melrose neighborhood, knocking on doors, questioning residents, and mapping out every possible route Minnie could have taken from school. They interviewed her classmates, teachers, and anyone who might have seen her during those final hours. Investigators were looking for anything unusual, a strange car, an unfamiliar person in the area, any detail that might lead them to the perpetrator. The evidence phase revealed both promise and frustration. While they had DNA evidence from the crime scene, the genetic databases available in 1999 were primitive compared to today's technology. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, was still in its early stages, containing far fewer profiles than it would in later years. The DNA sample was entered into the system, but it produced no matches. Similarly, fingerprint analysis yielded nothing that connected to known criminals. Investigators began building a suspect profile. They were looking for someone who knew the area well enough to move undetected, someone who had access to Minnie's route home, and someone capable of overpowering a 13-year-old girl without drawing attention. The nature of the crime suggested they were dealing with a dangerous individual, possibly someone who had committed similar offenses before. The suspect phase brought its own challenges. Detectives investigated known offenders in the area, cross-referencing their locations with the timeline of Minnie's disappearance. They looked into transients, delivery drivers, and anyone who might have had reason to be in the neighborhood that afternoon. Every lead was followed, every alibi checked, but none produced the breakthrough they desperately needed. Interview after interview was conducted. Family members, friends, neighbors, teachers, and schoolmates all provided statements. Investigators were particularly interested in anyone who had regular interaction with Minnie or who might have noticed her routines. They questioned maintenance workers, store clerks, and residents of the buildings along her route home. Despite the thoroughness of these interviews, no clear suspect emerged. The investigation was plagued by false leads that consumed valuable time and resources. A suspicious man seen near the school was tracked down and cleared. A car that didn't belong in the neighborhood was traced to a visiting relative. Anonymous tips poured in, each requiring follow-up, but none led to substantive evidence. The investigation was thorough, but it was also like searching for a needle in a haystack. Timeline gaps presented another major obstacle. The window between Minnie leaving school and her disappearance was narrow, but it was enough time for someone to commit the crime and dispose of her remains. Investigators worked to account for every minute, but the lack of witnesses during that crucial period left them with more questions than answers. So far, police had no leads, no motive, and no suspect. The DNA evidence sat in a database, waiting for a match that wouldn't come for over 2 decades. The community wasn't sleeping easy, and neither were the detectives assigned to the case. As months turned into years, the active investigation gradually wound down. The case wasn't closed, but it was no longer receiving the daily attention it once commanded. Detectives would periodically revisit the evidence, hoping new technology or a fresh perspective might reveal something they had missed. The DNA sample remained in the system, automatically checked against new entries, but year after year, there were no matches. The Soriano family never stopped fighting for justice. They organized vigils, distributed flyers, and kept Minnie's case in the public eye whenever possible. They met with detectives regularly, hoping for updates, praying for a breakthrough. But as the years passed, hope began to fade. The perpetrator, whoever he was, had seemingly vanished without a trace. What no one realized was that the person responsible for Minerliz Soriano's fate was living his life just blocks away from where she had lost her life, working, paying taxes, and maintaining the facade of a normal existence, while carrying the secret of what he had done to a 13-year-old girl who had trusted him. For 22 years, Joseph Martinez walked free, believing he had gotten away with his crime. He was wrong. By 2021, forensic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. The same technology that helped people discover distant relatives and build family trees was now being used to catch perpetrators who thought they had escaped justice forever. The NYPD's Cold Case Squad decided it was time to take another look at the DNA evidence from Minerliz Soriano's case. The genetic material collected from the crime scene in 1999 had been sitting in databases for over 2 decades, never finding a match through traditional methods. But forensic genealogy worked differently. Instead of looking for exact matches, investigators could now trace family connections through shared DNA segments, building family trees that eventually led them to potential suspects. The DNA sample from Minnie's case was submitted to a genealogy database, and for the first time in 22 years, something extraordinary happened. The system found genetic relatives, distant cousins, and family connections that created a roadmap leading investigators toward their suspect. Working with genetic genealogists, detectives began the painstaking process of building family trees and narrowing down possibilities. They traced lineages, cross-referenced public records, and slowly worked their way through generations of family connections. The process took months, but eventually a name emerged: Joseph Martinez. The revelation was staggering. Martinez wasn't a stranger who had randomly targeted Minnie. He was a former neighbor of the Soriano family, someone they had known, someone they had trusted. In 1999, when Minnie lost her life, Martinez was 27 years old and living in the same neighborhood where she disappeared. Even more shocking was what Martinez had been doing for the past 2 decades. He had built a respectable life, working for the New York City Department of Homeless Services. He was a city employee, someone who had taken an oath to serve the public, all while hiding the fact that he had taken the life of a 13-year-old girl. The investigation into Martinez revealed just how close he had been to the Soriano family. He had lived in their building complex, walked the same streets, and had regular interactions with neighbors who never suspected what he had done. When police had canvassed the neighborhood in 1999, they had likely spoken with Martinez himself. He had probably expressed sympathy for the family's loss, all while knowing exactly what had happened to Minnie. Investigators conducted surveillance on Martinez before making their move. They watched him go about his daily routine, going to work, running errands, living the normal life that Minerliz Soriano would never have the chance to experience. The irony was bitter. While working for the Department of Homeless Services, Martinez was helping vulnerable people, even as he carried the secret of destroying the most vulnerable victim of all. In February 2021, exactly 22 years after Minnie's passing, police moved in to arrest Joseph Martinez. The timing was not coincidental. Investigators wanted him to know that justice had finally found him on the anniversary of his crime. When they confronted him with the DNA evidence, Martinez's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. The man who had spent over 2 decades believing he had gotten away with his crime was about to learn that advances in science had caught up with him. The genetic material he had left at the crime scene in 1999 had become his downfall in 2021. The arrest of Joseph Martinez sent shockwaves through the Bronx community that had never forgotten Minerliz Soriano. On a cold February morning in 2021, NYPD detectives approached the 49-year-old city employee at his workplace. Martinez had no idea that decades of scientific advancement were about to destroy the lie he had been living for over half his life. When confronted with the DNA evidence linking him to Minnie's case, Martinez's reaction was telling. The man, who had successfully hidden among his neighbors for 22 years, suddenly found himself face to face with irrefutable proof of his guilt. There was no denying the genetic evidence that had traced its way through family trees and databases to land squarely at his door. Martinez was immediately arrested and charged with taking Minnie's life and assault of a minor. The charges carried the weight of over 2 decades of grief, investigation, and the relentless march of forensic science. As he was led away in handcuffs, Martinez's double life finally came to an end. The case that had haunted the NYPD's cold case squad for over 2 decades was finally solved. The DNA evidence that had sat dormant in databases since 1999 had found its purpose through the revolutionary power of genetic genealogy. What seemed impossible to investigators in 1999 had become inevitable by 2021. The breakthrough represented more than just solving a single case. It demonstrated how advances in DNA technology were changing the landscape of criminal investigation forever. Cold cases that had seemed hopeless were suddenly viable again. Perpetrators who thought they had escaped justice were learning that genetic evidence never forgets, never degrades, and never stops seeking the truth. Martinez's arrest made national headlines, highlighting both the power of forensic genealogy and the persistence of investigators who refused to let cases go cold. The same technology that had helped millions of people discover their family histories had now helped deliver justice for a 13-year-old girl who had been denied the chance to create a family history of her own. When Martinez appeared in court, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. Despite the overwhelming DNA evidence, he maintained his innocence, forcing the case toward trial. But the genetic proof was undeniable, and the scientific methods that had identified him were beyond dispute. Justice for Minerliz Soriano was finally within reach. Today, Minerliz Soriano would have been 35 years old. She might have been a mother herself, perhaps still writing poetry, certainly making her mark on a world that was denied the chance to see what she could have become. Instead, her life was cut short by someone who lived among her family and friends for decades, hiding behind a mask of normalcy while carrying the weight of an unthinkable crime. The case of Minerliz Soriano represents both the worst of human nature and the best of human determination. It shows us how evil can disguise itself in the most ordinary forms, but it also demonstrates that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still find its way to the truth. The advances in forensic science that finally identified Joseph Martinez have opened doors for countless other families, still waiting for answers about their own lost loved ones. For the Soriano family, Martinez's arrest marked the end of one chapter in their long journey toward justice, but it could never erase the 22 years of wondering, hoping, and grieving. The girl who loved poetry and dreamed of her future became a symbol of how technology and persistence can eventually triumph over even the most carefully hidden crimes. Some say justice was finally served when Martinez was arrested. Others argue that true justice would have been Minnie living the life she deserved. What remains undeniable is that forensic genealogy has forever changed the landscape of criminal investigation, ensuring that perpetrators can no longer count on time to protect them from the consequences of their actions. The DNA evidence never forgot, the investigators never gave up, and Minerliz Soriano's memory continues to demand justice, even from beyond the grave. If this case shows us anything, it's that justice can find a way, even after decades. Subscribe to see more cases where science and determination brought answers to families who never stopped believing. And check out this next video about another cold case.